Thank you all for joining us today for our IC Talk. I'm Elle Tusi, the co-chair of the International Community for the Society of Professional Journalists. We appreciate those of you that are taking the time to join us for our session. Before we get started with our guest, I want to make sure I go over some housekeeping items. So today's talk is a conversation with the guest and myself. I will be taking questions during our talk. So when you have a question, please make sure to add that to the Q&A portion. We will unmute you and you can ask the question directly. If you want me to ask the question for you, please make sure to make a note of that. I'm more than happy to do so. Please leave a chat section for any technical questions, links, and anything you want to share in the conversation in real time. My co-chair, Dan Kubisky, will keep an eye out for us on that. So our guest today is Ayesha Tanzeem. She serves as the chief of Voice of America's Afghanistan and Pakistan Bureau, and she's currently based in Islamabad. She's one of a very few foreign correspondents that have traveled to areas under the control and influence of the Islamic State militant group while it was at the peak of its power in eastern Afghanistan in 2015. Her reporting that brought to light tales of harrowing cruelty and suffering earned her the David Burke Award for Courage in Journalism. She has been the host of On the Line and Access Point with Ayesha Tanzeem, two of Voice of America's current affairs TV shows. Ayesha, we're really excited to have you today.
I'm really excited to be with us, PJ.
So Ayesha, usually when I start these talks, I kind of like to go back to the beginning, which seems like a good place to start. So can you tell us about why and what got you into journalism?
Oh, 2 words, short attention span. So back when I was in college, I attended a lot of classes. So I took a class on astronomy, and there was a biology class, and there was a film history class, and my father, of course, being a Desi father, which we call anybody belonging to the Indian subcontinent, wanted me to become a doctor. So my passive aggressive instinct said, I'm not going to become a doctor because my parents want me to. But to be very honest, I couldn't envision myself. I tried to, I couldn't envision myself sitting in a room day in, day out, talking to sick people. It's a very noble profession, not saying it's a bad thing. I'm just saying I couldn't envision myself sitting in a room all day. The idea of going around outside excited me, and it excited me for a number of reasons. One of them was that I grew up as a female. I went to school, elementary and middle school in Pakistan. And I was annoyed, even as a young girl, by the fact that my brother had more freedom of movement than I did. So any opportunity I had to go out, I wanted to avail it. And I wanted to have a career which allowed me to move around and go out and do things that other people cannot do. Because, of course, I grew up in a very competitive household. But the society made this distinction between men and women in terms of freedom of movement, how long you could stay out at night, whether you could have sleepovers or not, etc. And I wanted to, so my career choice was kind of part of my, life and upbringing. And as I said, my short attention span. So when I took all those classes and did all those things, I said, what can I do that'll allow me to do a little bit of everything and keep changing and going to the next thing and the next thing. And I realized journalism could be that thing.
And what led to you to, your career path now to where you're the chief bureau? Where did you first start? What was your beats that you were covering? And did you have this as an end goal for yourself?
So I was always more interested in international. I started in US in Macon, Georgia. For those who are in US who know, I still remember, that it was a local affiliate of Fox, and I started as a television producer for their 10 to 11 p.m. newscast. I always wanted to be a reporter, and I was always more intrigued with international reporting as opposed to national or local. And that's what always attracted me. And that's where I always wanted to end up. I wanted to end up being an international correspondent for someone. And that's what I always tried to do. And I got an opportunity, I worked with them. And then, of course, as we all do in the US in our journalism careers, we hop from job to job and from opportunity to opportunity. Eventually, I got a job in London with the BBC. Before that, I was freelancing and writing for some international websites. And then ended up, with VOA eventually when I came back from London to, at that time, New York. So a lot of city hopping, but I guess that's so normal for journalists in US. You just literally change cities every 3 years.
Right. It's par for the course, right?
Mm-hmm.
So now you're in Islamabad and you're in a region in covering a country that has been in the news this year, especially with, what's been happening with the Taliban takeover. And I'm certain we're going to go over this. So I'm hoping that maybe we can look into what does that mean right now? What's happening in Afghanistan from your perspective? And maybe we can start by talking about, can you give us an idea about how the Taliban is currently treating the media? Because it seems like they're giving them access to covering a lot of things. Is this like something to be surprised about, or can you discuss that with us?
Sure. So, I mean, the one thing that I keep repeating, and I don't think I can get enough of it, is what's happening in Afghanistan is surreal. Because for years, the Taliban were the so-called enemy. When I traveled to Afghanistan since 2015, the planning included how to avoid the Taliban and how to avoid being captured by the Taliban and how to avoid being kidnapped or ambushed or attacked by the Taliban. And now all of a sudden you go to Kabul and the Taliban are everywhere. And the Taliban are at security checkposts and they're the ones guarding your hotel and they're the ones checking your bag if something suspicious. I mean, they're the ones after an attack that are keeping you away from the attack site. And they're the ones who are outside the hospital, making sure irrelevant people are not going in with the wounded, etc. It's just weird. And surreal. You stand there, you look at them, these men, and how I think about it is it literally looks like digital manipulation. It looks like somebody took a video and digitally manipulated it so that all the places look the same and all the humans looked different. So exactly where the security forces were standing, now you have the Taliban standing with their long hair and their shalwar kameez and their guns. And a lot of them now, they used to all carry Kalashnikovs, but now a lot of them have M16s and American weapons, wow, armed to the teeth, walking all around you. So that's Kabul today. You're talking about media and access to the media. So to be very honest, nobody really knew what to expect when the Taliban took over.
Right.
And in some ways, we had some indication because the Taliban have operated kind of a shadow government for a while, and because of their Doha political office, which they'd been operating since 2013, and the fact that they had like an 18-month negotiation with the US during which they interacted with the media, and they started traveling to other countries and having press conferences, we got a glimpse of what might be to come. What we didn't know was whether the Taliban in Doha will behave the same way when they're in power in Kabul. And that's the part that was the unknown. So in some ways, we expected the Taliban to be like the 90s immediately. It's still too early to say if things might go down that way, and there could be multiple factors, and we can talk about them later. But for now, the Taliban are giving access to media. They're allowing, unlike the 90s when they had only one, Shariat radio, they're allowing private channels to operate. They're allowing international media to operate although obviously not freely.
Right.
So Afghanistan's vibrant media is gone. The media that used to rip the government apart over any small thing about appointments and, on performance and on security, etc. That kind of harsh criticism is gone. A lot of opinion is gone. A lot of self-censorship is there. A lot of Afghan journalists are not exactly saying what they want to say, or not filing the stories they want to file, but at the same time, they are reporting news. So, for example, today there were 2 blasts in Kabul, and all local media reported it. They tweeted it. They did news stories on it, the number of dead, etc. So there is media in Afghanistan. It's not a news battle, but the media is not. It's not as vibrant. It's kind of walking on pins and needles, not really sure what it can do and cannot do, testing the waters, sometimes getting beaten and taking steps back, sometimes gingerly taking a step forward. Everybody's in that mode of uncertainty.
Right. And are you finding that the Taliban is treating foreign journalists and Afghan journalists similarly or differently from your perspective?
They are treating the foreign journalists differently for various reasons, and that we find in this entire region, not just in Afghanistan, is that news or opinion in local languages is always taken more seriously. All regimes, but particularly by authoritarian regimes, because that directly reaches their constituencies. So if I print something in English, the English-speaking audience is going to read it. But if that same thing is published in Dari or Pashto, the Taliban's core constituency and the people they are now ruling, the Afghan public, the population will read it. That, in the opinion, I think, or it seems like it, is Taliban think is far more powerful as far as they're concerned, and therefore they're more concerned about it. So international media, they also seem to have learned a thing or two about international diplomacy from the years of talking to various governments and NGOs and UN, etc. in Doha. They do realize that they have limited power to control international media.
Right.
I mean, unless they want the entire world to just sanction them and outcast them, they're not going to attack journalists right, left, and center at a time when they're desperately looking for recognition. They're looking for aid. They're looking for their assets to be frozen. So they have limited control over what international media can do and say, especially when international journalists are in a privileged position of holding foreign passports and being able to go in and out of the country, by choice, which is not.
I think you bring up something very important about the access in and out of the country. Because what was it, just like a month or two ago when the transition was happening, many were calling it a bit of a mess of trying to get as many people out of the country for their safety. And for the sake of our conversation, we're focusing on journalists. I mean, there were so many efforts of trying to help Afghan journalists out of the country. Can you tell me more about, more about that situation? What does that mean for the Afghan journalists that weren't able to get out of the country, and what that experience was trying to help those that were able to get out?
So the first week or two, especially till August 31st, still those scenes of that we also saw, those were horrendous. And I was outside the airport and we all saw those scenes, and, mothers getting separated from their little children, etc. There was also a lot of uncertainty, and nobody knew whether the Taliban would go on a killing spree, whether they would go on a house-to-house search, whether they would go looking for journalists who filed anti-Taliban stories or stories critical of Taliban behavior. So there was a lot of fear and anxiety. Some of that fear and anxiety has kind of abated now, literally 2 months down the line, because the Taliban have not gone on that kind of a killing spree. Now the anxiety is that the Taliban are still in this holding pattern where they're waiting for recognition. And therefore, a lot of Afghans believe that they're still on their best behavior because they're waiting for recognition. And if they don't get that recognition, then maybe then they will show their real face. So there's a lot of anxiety still about what's to come. But that fear that the day after takeover, Taliban will go after everybody and kill all the journalists, that has abated a little bit. And I know that a lot of media organizations, ours included, but a lot of international media organizations, every organization that I know of and every foreign correspondent that I know of or talked to, they were all evacuating their people. And a lot of journalists got out through the evacuation flights. A lot of journalists got out after August 1st through various means. So some were taken via plane to Qatar directly. Some traveled either Pakistan or Central Asia via either the land route or through planes. Some were helped by neighboring countries, gave them visas, who happened to have Afghan passports, gave them visas. Some got out that way. So hundreds of, if not thousands of people have gotten out since the evacuation officially ended. And out of those thousands, hundreds have been journalists. Right. And a lot of international organizations are working on it right now.
And what do you think would, what could organizations like SPJ or many others do to help in this situation from your perspective? What would be the most beneficial for these journalists?
I think the most important thing organizations like SPJ do is keep the pressure on various governments that are negotiating with the Taliban. Because the fact that the Taliban would allow Afghans with visas to go to the airport, they could block them. But they're allowing people with visas to go to the airport is a result of intense pressure from international community. Every time there's a meeting between the Taliban and anybody from UN to EU to US or any other senior officials, this issue is brought up. The right of Afghans who want to leave the country to leave. And I think the best thing we can do as journalists is keep that pressure on. Let the Taliban know that if they want recognition, if they want to interact with the world, if they want to act like a government, and they want people to treat them like a government, then they need to give the rights that governments grant their citizens, which is the right to free movement. And if people want to leave the country, they should have the right to leave the country. So I think there's still a lot of negotiation going on with the Taliban, and governments are doing it. And we can keep the pressure on the governments. And we can also keep the pressure on the Taliban. We can ask them these questions during our interviews, as we do, as a lot of journalists do.
Right. I noticed that there's a few more people that have joined us. If anyone has any questions for Ayesha, please make sure to put them in the Q&A section. We will unmute you and go ahead and you can ask her your questions. Otherwise, make sure to make a note if you'd like me to ask it for you. I'm more than happy to do that. So Ayesha, I'd love for you to talk about what it's like to be a woman, a female journalist in that region, the obstacles, maybe there aren't any obstacles. Maybe I want you to see if you can share your experience with us so people get an idea of what it's like to be a woman in that region being a journalist.
So it's a mixed bag, but I don't think it's a bad thing. I think in this region, it's actually a good thing to be a female journalist because you get access to the other half of the population that a lot of male journalists don't have. So I can go inside houses in the most conservative areas of Afghanistan and Pakistan. I can go inside the houses. I can watch, I can observe, which is what journalists do. I can sit with the women and I can talk to them about their problems. They will introduce me to their children. A lot of times, male journalists only get access to the outside of the house. And then I also found that when I go to events, I go to protests, when I go to, any place where there's a large gathering or a crowd, a lot of times, because I'm a female journalist, they will allow me to move forward, not push me back like they might a male journalist. They would allow me to get ahead and take pictures, or they'd allow me to get ahead and also give me more access. Somehow there's less suspicion of a female journalist than a male journalist. You kind of see them in their body language. Their guards are not as up as they are with male journalists. So in this region, I find that it's quite beneficial to be a female journalist. Of course, there is a downside to it too, which is, you have as a female to be very careful to make sure, people in this region have very fragile egos. And sometimes when you say no to something or reject something, be it an invitation or an advance or a sexual hint or connotation, and you very gently reject it, sometimes they take that rejection to heart and take it personally. And there are only so many sources that you as a journalist can lose before it becomes difficult for you to do your job. So that's the big challenge in this region. Keep that balance. You do get more access, but you have to balance it very, very carefully to start setting up the stage right from the beginning, to let everybody know this is very professional. I'm going to be very professional. Our interaction is going to be very professional. We are not going to go into any territory that's even gray. And that takes some practice, because, in US, certain things are just normal. The kind of free interaction that you have with people, chit-chatting, etc., is normal. Whereas here, sometimes people could take a meaning in it that didn't exist. So you have to kind of watch how you behave, your body language, how you interact with them, and constantly try to balance it.
Right. It's funny. It's great that you mentioned that, because that was going to be my next question, is because you have that unique experience of being in the US reporting, and then also in, right now you're in Pakistan. So what would be those differences as a female? And I think you've just touched on it a little bit. Is there anything else that would be a major difference that you've seen in your experience in the US as opposed to Pakistan, and as a woman journalist?
That's one of the big ones, where in US you have to, there is kind of this understanding, especially when you're dealing with officials, especially when you're dealing with the people in power. Mm-hmm. Especially because people think, there's this understanding, and with all the new laws protecting women, laws on harassment, etc., officials are very careful. Whereas in this region, officials, men in power, are used to getting away with a lot more. So when they can, they may try to, and that's why you have to start setting up the boundaries even before your interaction starts. In order to not let it get to a point where you have to say no or reject something, which chances are they might take personally, and then you lose them as a source. So that's one of the biggest difference. The other big difference is that I think the advantages, so that's on the negative side, and on the positive side, the advantages that I mentioned of being a woman in this region, which is you do get better access, you do get more, if you're in a press conference, you're more likely to get your question taken. If you've put in a request for an interview, you're more likely to get it compared to a male colleague, etc. So I think that difference is less so in US, whether you're a male or female, it's the same almost. Whereas here, I do feel you're at an advantage if you're a female.
Right. It looks like we have a question that just came in from Jessica Quinlan. If we can go ahead and unmute her, Dan, and you can ask the question directly to Ayesha.
Okay, so what type of safety precautions did I take while I was in a war zone? Well, all the precautions that you are supposed to take. So they start with planning your travel and knowing where you're going and what kind of risks exist in that particular area. The entire country is not the same. Different regions are different. The threat is different in different regions. So you need to know the exact region or sub-region that you're going to, what is the threat there. So for example, the biggest threat in Afghanistan while the war was going on was kidnapping for ransom. A lot of times the active war was far from you. So the war was going on in a district, Helmand, there's fighting in Helmand, and fighting is not 24/7. I mean, I have seen bombs drop in front of me. I mean, I've taken cell phone videos of it, but that's rare. It's not every day that you see bullets flying and bombs dropping. It happens once in a while, but a lot of times you're covering the aftermath. So for example, the explosions in Kabul today, you would cover the aftermath. You would go to the hospital, you would meet the families, you would do the stories of the families and who was there and who was lost. So you cover, a lot of times it would cover the aftermath of the attack or the violence, because the war was happening somewhere else. But because the country was at war, law and order was really bad. The police was preoccupied with helping the military fight a war, and searching for militants in Taliban. So kidnappings were very easy, and kidnapping for ransom were very common, and that was the biggest threat that we usually prepared for. And that included everything from, I never used security or a bulletproof vehicle. I'm sorry, when I speak too much.
No, I have to against me all the time. So I'm curious, do you do risk assessments prior to the stories that you're going to conflict zones? Is this like a consistent practice of doing risk assessments, or how does that work for you?
Yes. I mean, whenever you're going to a new area, you do a risk assessment with your team, sometimes with security experts. So for example, when I traveled to, as you said in the intro, I traveled to Eastern Afghanistan, to Nangarhar, which was at that point literally the hotbed of Daesh. The government did not have its writ there. There were areas that were under ISIS control. So you had to sit down with your team and do a proper risk assessment of what is safe to do, what is not safe to do, what time of the day can you travel, can you spend the night there, is it safe to travel, so for example, there were certain highways in Afghanistan at the time where you knew that in the morning at this hour, the Afghan army does a sweep for IEDs. So going right after that, chances of your car hitting an IED were less because they're just on a sweep. There were parts of the country where you absolutely didn't want to travel at night. So you knew that your distance needed to be you had to travel between certain hours of the day from this time to this time. There were parts of the country, even parts of the city, like there were parts of Kabul where we would go in knowing that we would not spend more than an hour in doing on that story. We'd come back. If we had to go back, we would go back on a random day, but outside standing, doing your stand up, you would not spend more than 10 minutes because, this was an area more known for kidnappings and you didn't want somebody to spot you as a target. Again, like I said, I always traveled in a beat up car that looked like every other car in Afghanistan. There were no bulletproof SUVs that only rich people can afford in a very poor country. So, and I always had like my local clothing and my local burqa, or the blue one or the black one, depending upon what local women in that particular area wore. So I think the best defense, and it is for a female journalist, is to be invisible and be just another woman on the street. Right. And, if you don't stand out, the chances of you getting caught in something ugly are less.
And how important is it for freelancers that are in the region or would love to cover this particular region What would be your recommendations or tips on how to do that successfully?
Yeah, you mean female journalists or any journalist?
Female, or whichever you decide. I mean, journalism as a whole, and if there's differences as a female, maybe you can mention what that would be.
Right. Right. Oh, there's a huge difference as a female, and I always tell everybody because nobody else understands. I'm sorry, guys. This is something. So in this region, men have no problem going to the toilet, right? And females, like my biggest problem was managing my bodily fluids. Like when I was going to certain regions, I knew that I couldn't drink anything all day, because I would not find a bathroom.
I was in Jordan. I did the same thing. I would not drink anything all day.
Yeah. And then I'd come in the evening and I'd drink like a fish to hydrate myself. And then all night long, I'll try to empty my bladder so that next day I had an empty bladder. So yeah, that's the biggest difference in this region between men and women. Like I said, if you're going to coming to this region or going to any region like this, it's always good to talk to locals, talk to local journalists, talk to if you're going to talk to security people, I would highly recommend you talk to security people on the ground who have experience of working on the ground, rather than somebody sitting in London or New York or Washington, because there is no substitute for, being there, being able to absorb the atmosphere and being able to decipher what the nuances are. So there's no one size fits all in regions like this. What applies to one situation, to one person, doesn't apply to another situation and another person. And therefore, know the region by talking to locals before you get there. I mean, something as simple as, who to trust can save your life. Most of the kidnappings in Afghanistan used to have insider information. So be very careful as to who you can trust, especially if you are with foreign media or with NGO. You may think you offer nothing, but to anybody in a region like that, which is war-torn, where people are desperate, where they cannot buy food for their children, a couple of $1,000s is a lot of money. And any foreigner is looked upon as somebody that someone will be willing to pay money for. So it could be your family, your government, your NGO, your news organization. So even if you don't have money in your bank account, locals would think that somebody would be able to pay for you. And therefore you have to be aware of the fact that you are a target, simply because you're a foreigner. And
how important is that relationship with the fixer? Like, say, as a foreigner, you come into Afghanistan or Pakistan, essentially you would need someone like a local coordinator or a fixer to help get the lay of the land. How important is that relationship for those that are coming in? Can you talk about that?
That's one of the most important relationships. Half the job, if you don't have a good local person to guide you, and not just guide you as to where to find your stories or how to find your stories, but how to do it safely. I always wanted the people I worked with to be aware of what was going on around them. And one of our standard SOPs when we went into a dangerous region was that if we're a team of 3 people or 4 people, usually it was a team of 2 or 3 people, that if any one of us spotted something or just had a feeling even, we're not going to worry about the story, we're just going to leave and we'll come back for the story another day. So I wanted to make sure the locals that I worked with, and all of them became good friends, understood that for me, my story was not more important than my or their security. They were usually more at risk. I mean, we heard cases, multiple cases where the foreigners were kidnapped, the locals were killed. So they were more at risk. Their lives were more at risk than my life ever was. And that relationship with your local fixer, field producer, local journalist, whoever it is that you're working with, That's the most important relationship you can have in a region. That will make or break your trip. Whether you can get good stories, whether you can get good sources, whether you get the right sound bites out of them because your questions are translated properly, and the answers are translated back properly, whether you come out with like that award-winning story or whether it's just like a blah story, it depends a lot on the local team you're working with.
And so maybe give us an idea about what's the status of press freedom in Afghanistan, and maybe you can tell us about Pakistan as well, since you're located there. What is that status right now?
It's a mixed bag right now. So obviously, as I said, Afghanistan's once really vibrant media is not that vibrant anymore, but it is still there. So I was looking at some stats today, and I'm just going to read them out. So 75% of the media houses in Afghanistan have closed, and most of them have closed because of financial reasons, because Afghan economy is in a downward spiral. All the money, it had become a dependent economy. 75% of the government's budget, 45% of the GDP came from foreign aid. So all of that money frozen or gone. A lot of media houses were supported by political parties, NGOs, sometimes government. That money's gone, so they're closing. A lot more are on the brink of closure. So that alone is going to have a huge impact, especially in the most vulnerable parts of the country, the smaller towns and villages, where you will have nobody to report on what's going on. Even when the Taliban advanced, and as they advanced, the areas where they were coming, all the journalists were fleeing. So all those areas started becoming news black holes. So in that way, Afghanistan is going through a difficult period. And the most difficult thing is, and the most dangerous thing is the self-censorship. As I said, there's huge uncertainty as to how the Taliban would react to something. So the Taliban have introduced, for example, these 11 rules of journalism, which sound very good, but they're so vague that they can be used for repression and censorship, and they are used. So, for example, don't insult national figures, and don't do things contrary to Islam. And nobody explains really what that means. So any story could be deemed contrary to Islam. Don't do too much negative reporting. Don't do stories that would lessen people's morale or damage their morale. How do you define that? Any negative story would damage the public's morale. I mean, every story that I've done would damage their morale really badly.
Right.
So, these are rules that are very hard to define, and therefore there's huge self-censorship. And in fact, one of the stories that I filed today, and maybe you guys have shared the link, is about a female journalist who was running a channel, an all-female run TV channel. She did not close because of financial reasons. She closed because of threats and censorship, because she was showing her content included romantic dramas, etc., which she needed to run for, to keep the station up and running. And the Taliban didn't like it. So that's the negative side. There is a silver lining in the cloud, which is I talked to journalists on the ground, especially safety committees and journalist organizations, and they said that the Taliban are becoming more responsive to complaints of arrests of journalists, etc. The big problem is the difference in, there's a huge communication gap between the Taliban and the journalists, or us, for example. So when I went to get my accreditation letter this time, I went to Kabul, you have to get an accreditation from Taliban. Mm-hmm. They said, you're free to do anything, but you cannot cover illegal protests. And I said, what are illegal protests? Well, any protest that's not pre-approved by the Taliban is an illegal protest, which means all the protests by the women and activists, etc. That's blatant censorship.
That kind of goes against a protest, right?
Exactly.
Protests can just come up in the spur of the moment. So
exactly. And also there are parts of the country where you have to go to their local cultural commission, especially local media has to go to the local cultural director before you work on a story. So literally let them vet the story before you even work on the story. So that's censorship. That's, pre-censorship, you can call it. So there's a lot of censorship and self-censorship in Afghanistan right now. That's the negative part. And there's a lot of uncertainty about security. And the other thing adding to the uncertainty is that there are other elements in Afghanistan and nobody knows how they will behave. And one example of that is, and it's not directly linked to journalism, but it's similar of this firing on a wedding in eastern Afghanistan in Nangarhar, where apparently, seemingly, some people dressed like the Taliban and fired on the wedding to try to stop the music playing. And the Taliban are saying they were not us and we've arrested people, we're investigating, but you have all these other people. They may not officially be the Taliban, but they're like-minded or think that that's how things should be handled. And same with journalism. There was one story that I was reading about how a journalist was going back home on local transport. Somebody asked him who he works for. Used to be a radio station that was funded by US aid. And the guy just said, oh, you work for those foreigners? And just stopped the car and public transport and shot him in the leg. Yeah. So all this uncertainty, because you don't know, how the Taliban will react, but where else the threat can come from. It can be a random man on the street who may not have acted this way previously, but because now the Taliban are in power, feels empowered to act this way because he thinks, or mostly it's he. I have not seen any females attack so far, so that's why I'm using the word he. So one incident that happened with me on my last trip to Kabul was before the Taliban takeover, and that's never happened to me in Kabul. Was that a man came and attacked my cameraman. I was doing a stand up in front of the camera on a Kabul street in Kabul, and the man came and attacked my cameraman and in Pashto started arguing with him about how this is un-Islamic. So like I said, it's the unknown and it's the uncertainty of where the threat might come from and all the unknown elements involved. Taliban are a huge factor of it, but they're not the only factor. And now with Daesh attacks increasing, that's the other big threat.
And so Ayesha, does working with Voice of America cause any extra precaution on your part? Is that something that you thought about, or has anything come about having, Voice of America attached to you as like a label?
I don't think so. I don't think that, the Taliban or others think of VOA journalists as more evil than, let's say, Washington Post and New York Times, NPR. They're all foreign propaganda machines that are spreading, propaganda against us. Right. So I think a lot of foreign journalists are in the same boat as I am.
Okay. And then can we go over what the status of press freedom is in Pakistan as well?
Yes, definitely. So the status of press freedom in Pakistan is not good. Okay. There is and a lot of international media organizations and human rights organizations have written on it, and we've covered it extensively. So there's a facade of press freedom because there are a lot of news channels, and there is a vibrant media. I'm not saying the media is not vibrant when it comes to politicians and the government, but there are sacred cows and there are red lines, and you cross the red line, you can get anything from fired to trolled online to physically assaulted to kidnapped. by intelligence agencies and tortured sometimes, as happened to bloggers and as happened to some journalists. You can be killed even. Some journalists have been killed, and some journalists have been attacked with the seeming intent of killing them. They survived. So all of this, and a lot of this is coming from multiple actors. So political parties are now a smaller part of it. There used to be a time when political parties, or at least some political parties, had militant wings that would go after journalists, but mostly it's either various, militant organizations that are operating in the country. They could be religious actors, Islamist groups who could beat you up or attack you or accuse you of blasphemy, which in Pakistan is tantamount to a death sentence. You can be lynched by a mob if you're accused of blasphemy. And government actors, particularly the intelligence agency. I mean, the ISI, even when it comes to missing persons in the Human Rights Committee in the Senate, their involvement was pointed out. So in Pakistan, journalists also self-censor, even though it's supposedly a democracy right now. Journalists self-censor. A lot of good journalists I know are out of a job. Right. Under various excuses, and they lost their jobs after particular stories they did or particular topics they covered, even though they were told it was due to, financials or cut downs or whatever, but they seem to have been the only ones affected by it. So a lot of good journalists are out of a job. A lot of journalists I know have faced these things. Their houses have been ransacked. They've been attacked. They've faced bullets. They've faced beatings. They faced sexual assaults. So yes, and now the threat, now that some actors in Pakistan believe that they've controlled the mainstream media, they're now going after social media. So they're trying to introduce laws which would make it very difficult for people who are on social media to operate.
It almost sounds like there's more danger in Pakistan as opposed to Afghanistan being a journalist. Am I right to assume that from what you just told us?
In some ways it is, because in Afghanistan, now the Taliban are in power, but in previous government, you did not feel like, the government is going to come and kidnap you or arrest you. And by government, I mean certain elements of the government. But you were scared of militant groups. There are lots of militant groups in Afghanistan. Taliban were one of them, but there were others. In Pakistan, the state, when you have the state machinery working for something like surveillance, like there's a cliche almost in Pakistan, every journalist believes his phone's being tapped. Every journalist believes that their communication devices are unsafe. Everybody's looking for the next best encrypted communication app. So it used to be WhatsApp, then now it's Signal, now it's, Wicker or something else, because everybody believes, as do all the politicians, everybody believes their phones are being tapped and their conversations are being listened to. And there's plenty of evidence of that. So from time to time, we see on social media conversations of politicians, private drawing room conversations being leaked. So somebody recorded them and somebody kept them in a file and somebody released them. So these recordings, people believe, are used to later on blackmail them. If you ever, so the recordings are done for two reasons. One is to keep a tab on what you're doing, what you're working on, who you're meeting, and the other is in case you're doing something that you should not be doing by social standards or by the society's moral standards, etc., that can be then used to blackmail you. So, people's private affairs, etc. So everybody's afraid of that. There's this constant, fear of your conversation, somebody overhearing your conversations.
There's always a third party tapping in.
Yes, exactly. And you kind of never get used to it. It's weird. Even when you're having an ordinary conversation with your family, you don't want an outsider listening in on, your
or having to subconsciously think, well, let me make sure I'm careful about what I say, because that alters a natural conversation, right?
Exactly.
And I know you mentioned earlier social media. I mean, that's something we've covered before too, about journalists, how they, I think last year we had another woman who was from Abu Dhabi, I believe, and she was talking about how she was being doxxed online and in social media. We had Maria Ressa, who, everyone knows the story about what's been happening to her on social media. And so, what is the situation there on social media safety, and what can we, as journalists that are in that region, think about when it comes to being safe on social media and online in their reporting?
I mean, in this region, it's really bad. I mean, women journalists in Pakistan have constantly been complaining about it. I was in a session earlier with this other group, Coalition for Women in Journalism, that was talking about this very issue. And female anchors are horribly trolled. And sometimes you can see that the trolling is coming from a mainstream political party, the supporters, and sometimes the leaders join in. So it's literally like a dog whistle. They would drop a hint. They would not directly say something, but they would drop a hint that their followers would pick up and then horribly troll that person. It's taking a mental toll on journalists. Some of them end up unhooking totally from their devices for days or weeks, sometimes months. Others don't, but it does take a toll on them, especially when they say things about family, when they make sometimes sexual threats, and very violent sexual threats. You think
these platforms should have a responsibility for what's happening to journalists, not just in journalists, but that kind of doxing and attacks, it's happening to so many different people on social media, like on Twitter or Instagram, whatever it may be. Do you think that social media platforms should be responsible to some degree about what's happening on these platforms and what's being said?
I mean, at least they should be able to help track down who's doing it, and not let them hide behind anonymity. Especially, I also don't want them to go after all the activists, etc., and not allow anonymity at all, because there are a lot of activists and there are a lot of journalists who are working in very dangerous environments, and the anonymity is the only way they can publish what they publish. But there should be clear guidelines of what constitutes doxing, what constitutes a threat, what constitutes trolling, and if you're doing that, then somebody should be able to identify who's doing it, and there should be legal recourse. But like I said, it's one of those things where the balance is very difficult to achieve, because a lot of times regimes, especially repressive regimes, dictatorships, take the very things you create to safeguard someone, and they use those tools to go after their critics, and take any criticism as, oh, this is trolling, and therefore this person needs to be identified. So this needs to be a conversation on an international level. Standards need to be defined, and standards that everybody in the world can adhere to and agree with, just like journalism standards, universal journalism standards are not followed in every country, but at least if you ask people in general what are international standards of journalism, people can tell you.
Right. I agree with you. I know we're coming into the last 5 minutes of our conversation. So if there's anyone that has any questions, please make sure to get them in the next few minutes. So Ayesha, one thing we do ask all of our guests at the end of our conversations is, because we focus on press freedom actually as an organization. So what does press freedom mean to you?
Well, what press freedom means to me as a journalist is that when I sit down to write a story, I should not be thinking about should I publish the story or should I not? The only thought that should be in my mind is my story balanced? Have I given a fair chance to all sides? Is it objective as possible? I should not be thinking about possible repercussions for me or my organization. I should not be thinking about whether I'll face negative consequences, whether my organization will face negative consequences, as it happens in this region all the time. I mean, a majority of Pakistani journalists self-censor, and now a majority of Afghan journalists self-censor. So when you sit down if you want a really free press, I think the way you gauge it is when a journalist sits down to write a story, are they thinking about the story or are they thinking beyond the story to what would happen when the story is published? And I think the day I can sit down in front of my computer and only think about the story, that's when I know journalism is free.
Wonderful. And is there anything you want to add to the conversation that we may not have discussed that you think is important to cover or to go over?
Oh, I think we've covered, most of everything that we set out to cover. I think one thing that we need to keep in mind in Afghanistan is that Taliban are not necessarily behaving this way because of self-teaching or self-awareness. Whatever leniency we are seeing in their behavior is a result of years of interactions and pressure from international groups, from governments, from organizations. It's a combination of pressure and it's a combination of interaction which has led to learning. So they have picked up what international expectations and demands are and what international human rights mean. And I, as a journalist, was intrigued to find out that they started using that language in their own press releases when they were fighting the insurgency. They would accuse the government of human rights abuses. They would accuse the Afghan government of breaking international law, which meant that they had absorbed the language and they understood what the language meant and they understood the impact of the language. So, as journalists, we need to both keep up the pressure, but also keep on engaging because we've seen that that's had an impact. The Afghanistan's media has taken a huge leap backward, as have women's rights and other things. But the Taliban are a reality now, and they're not going away, at least not in the near future. So the only way forward is for journalists and organizations is to not leave the space that they still have, that is left, to occupy that space, strongly stand there firmly, and then try to expand from there. It's a setback, it's a huge setback, but that doesn't mean that this war is lost.
Well, Ayesha, thank you so much for today. I could talk to you for hours, and I hope that we can have you back again sometime very soon. And for those of you that have joined us today, please make sure to pay attention to our newsletter that's going to be coming out end of the week. We'll be posting our next talks that we're going to be hosting going into November and December. Again, Ayesha, thank you so much for joining us. And I hope that we can stay in touch and then have an update on what's happening in Afghanistan with you.
Definitely. I really enjoyed it. And I really hope to be back and, keep in touch.
Thank you. And thank you all for joining us. Please stay tuned to the newsletter for our future information for our future talks. Thank you all for joining us. Have a great day.
Thank you. Bye.